They followed up destroying the Office of Net Assessment on the weekend by shutting down, the Voice of America and all the other radios, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Asia, and I guess Radio Marti. So I guess Marco Rubio doesn't really care about freedom and democracy in Cuba. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark. I'm Eric Edelman. I'm a contributor to the Bulwark and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. And I'm joined by my partner in this doom and gloom enterprise, Eliot Cohen, who is Professor Emeritus of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Happy St. Patrick's Day, Eliot, to all who celebrate.
Yeah, indeed. The Cohens are not really well known for their celebration of St. Patrick's Day. Although it was my late mother's birthday, so we did celebrate that. But we're all in favor.
And I know you like Irish whiskey, so
I do like single malt Irish whiskey and soda bread, and that's about it. So we're going to be talking about some various heavy things because the Trump administration was doing a lot of damage. But I thought I might, if with your permission, inaugurate an occasional series on Shield of the Republic, which is sort of the latest piece of jackassery from the Trump administration, which isn't necessarily a tragedy or a major sabotaging of American national security or aid and comfort to our enemies, which they have been doing with increasing regularity. But like I said, just, a piece of sheer dumb stupidity. And so my favorite for this week was the Pentagon getting very excited about the fact that it thinks that Mark Milley didn't meet the weight standards. And therefore, everybody's going to be doing push-ups all the time. And they're going to reemphasize physical fitness standards. And the two thoughts that occurred to me, one which was shared with me by a guy with a lot of military experience, a lot more than Pete Hegseth's, saying, this is what every incompetent commander does when he takes over a new unit and he has no idea what he's supposed to do. He says, we're going to up the physical fitness standards. The other thing is that the only historical parallel that I can think of for this sort of the obsession with which Hegseth seems to approach this is the Armistice Army of Vichy France. And if any of our listeners Google recruiting posters for the Armistice Army, you'll see that they're mainly pictures, either drawings or actual pictures of young men who kind of look like the way Pete Hegseth, I think, would like to look and would like them to look. The only thing which I think he should be a little bit concerned about is there is a kind of vaguely homoerotic side to that. And, that could be troubling where he's from.
Yeah, I mean, there is all this emphasis on, the culture war aspects of this. And despite all the protestations about we're going to make the military more lethal and more agile and, restore the warrior ethos and all of that, there's been precious little otherwise that would indicate anything serious going on in a positive way in the Department of Defense. Lots of negative, which we can get to. Actually, why don't we use that to get to one of the negatives, which was the disestablishment of the Office of Net Assessment on Thursday last week. Why don't you explain to our listeners and viewers kind of what the Office of Net Assessment was?
Sure. So this, I will tell you, this one hit me personally very hard because my first real engagement with Washington came in the early to mid 80s when, as a young Army Reserve officer, I was assigned to the Office of Net Assessment. So the Office of Net Assessment existed for over half a century. It was founded by a remarkable man, Andrew Marshall, one of the original Rand set from the 50s. And it was, at one level, it was fundamentally about assessing military balances, which you might think people do all the time, but actually they don't. The intelligence community doesn't look at its own side, it looks only at the other side. And military planners tend to focus on, well, what do we want to do to the other guy, not, what did the other guy want to do to us? And he first began doing this for Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council staff. And then Jim Schlesinger, who he had known from Rand, stole him and brought him over to the Defense Department. He was there for over 40 years. And when net assessment was a tiny office, maybe a dozen people, a dozen professionals, if that. A few civilians, a lot of military officers who rotated through. Some of the work they did was extraordinarily classified. Some of I think the space balance, like only 3 people could read or something like that at one point. There was the iconic, the state of the military balance in Central Europe, and various other, or North Korea on the Korean Peninsula. These were kind of very substantial analytic works. But then there was also an enormous amount of sponsored research. And I've described this when Andy passed in 2019, there was a memorial service for him. I wrote a bit of an obit, which we can link to, which we can post on on our website.
We were both at that service.
Yeah, it was moving. It was very warm because Andy was this sort of Yoda-like figure, but he really sponsored most of the serious thinking about American national security and strategy for half a century. And, a lot of the classic works, well, one way or another, you're going to find Andy Marshall's fingerprints on them. And, and it remained, even after he passed, an extremely useful office, a little bit lower profile, although he kept it very low profile, but doing exactly the same sort of thing. And I just want to say, the office was suddenly shuttered. All of the staff were dispersed. There was no forewarning. The Secretary of Defense and his staff never talked to any of the members, including the director, as far as I know, never read any of its product. And they just decided to obliterate it. Now, there's weasel language in the announcement, which says, well, they'll stick to the statute. There's a statute which says there will be an independent office of net assessment. But the first paragraph says we're going to disestablish it. So even if they bring it back as some sort of zombie organization, it won't really exist. So this was, it's a little office, a dozen people, a research budget, maybe like $10, $20 million max. And you might think it's insignificant. It's not insignificant at all. This was kind of a major blow to the intellectual infrastructure supporting thinking about American defense and American strategy. And it was just wanton vandalism. That's all you can describe it as.
Yeah, full disclosure, both of us have benefited from sponsorship by the Office of Net Assessment. But yeah, it is hard to imagine a more self-destructive act than this. First of all, just to add to your list of iconic documents, one of the famous comments that was made during the Cold War about the nuclear balance between the United States and the Soviet Union was Harold Brown's famous comment, which was, when we build, they build. When we stop building, they still build. And that was originally marginalia on an Andrew Marshall, Jim Roach net assessment of the strategic nuclear balance that was, I think, originally prepared for Don Rumsfeld and then ultimately passed on to Harold Brown when he became secretary. I first got to work with Andy Marshall when I was a young, young Foreign Service officer, but on detail to the Pentagon under then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, running the office that had been established for Soviet affairs. And during that time, the Soviet Union collapsed. It became Russian affairs. And one of the duties that Cheney gave me was to organize a kind of quarterly seminar, Saturday morning seminar for him with outside Russia experts. And I worked with Andy Marshall to pull together those experts, including a number who had done research for the Office of Net Assessment. He for a long time, for instance, was a sponsor of the demographic work of Murray Feshbach. And as a result of that, he understood the demographic crisis that was driving the Soviet Union towards the brink of collapse. And in a lot of ways, the Pentagon in the Bush 41 administration, when the Soviet Union collapsed, was the best situated department of the government to understand all this because of his pioneering work. I'll tell you something else, which is when I was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the war in Iraq wasn't going so great. Some of the work that he sponsored, some of the assessments that he sponsored of the war, which ran very counter to what the senior leadership wanted to hear, turned out to be very useful for me personally. And his willingness to sponsor that kind of research, and some of the research he sponsored, quite honestly, I mean, there were some goofy outliers, but that was part of his understanding that sometimes you were going to sponsor research that wasn't going to end up providing you anything useful. You would think, by the way, that people who are supposedly motivated by the entrepreneurial spirit of Silicon Valley, who, where people know that a lot of things are going to fail before you can succeed, would kind of understand that. But there was no attention to that. And one of the things I'm concerned about is whether the, records and the archives of the office are being adequately preserved.
Well, I think that's a reasonable fear. I mean, just some of the other stuff that they did. Andy sponsored the work which made people realize, contrary to what the intelligence community was saying, that the Russian economy was in very bad shape.
Right.
And the military spending as a percentage of GDP was much higher.
Right.
Than everybody thought, but the baseline GDP was much lower, which actually squared with everybody's observations whenever they would travel to Russia. But there's also a lot of sort of very basic research. For example, there's a wonderful book called Knowing One's Enemies, which was edited by the great historian Ernest May, about net assessment before World War II. How did the French assess the Germans? How the British assessed the Japanese, and so on. And really, there's a vast amount of work that was produced by this, and the key to it, as you indicated, was integrity. I mean, Andy was a relentlessly curious, open-minded man who would go where the facts took him. And what you're seeing, I think, with the administration is they couldn't care less about any of that. They're completely incurious human beings, and they have no idea of what intellectual integrity is, which is why I think they're very likely to abolish the federally funded research and development centers, or at least the line item funding for them. Part of whose strength is that because they're a line item in the defense budget, they can be more independent than, a Beltway bandit sort of hireling consulting company, which has an incentive to tell the consumer what the consumer wants to hear from them. And don't have the kind of institutional commitments to integrity that some of these places do. So this is a tragic loss. But like I said, the thing that gets me about it is, typically for this administration, it was done in a mean-spirited way.
Yeah. Everything
is done with a almost kind of juvenile delight in being cruel. And then they just, put out this kind of ridiculous smear This is on the DoD Rapid Response
Right.
Team tweet that this is somehow connected with the Russian dossier. I mean, where do they get this? And it's this ignorance, this cruelty, this complete unsuitedness to lead our country's national defense. And I mean, this is a theme I'm going to come back to in a number of ways, including some work I want to do here at CSIS. We worry about the defense industrial base. I think it's also very important to be concerned about the defense intellectual base.
Yeah.
You need a very healthy set of subcultures that will produce strategic thought, and that will produce strategic thinkers, and that will produce strategic practitioners. And these guys are destroying that, and almost gleefully.
I think one of the shows that you were not available for, you were traveling. This is now about a year ago. We had Hal Brands on talking about the book he wrote about the Twilight Struggle, about the Cold War. One of the points that he makes in the book is we created a whole intellectual infrastructure for people to think about strategy who were not military professionals after the Cold War. And Rand was a big part of that, but not just Rand. I mean, obviously, it was the FFRDCs, as you mentioned, that came after Rand, the Center for Naval Analysis, the Institute for Defense Analysis, MITRE Corporation, and ONA, became a big part of that under Andy Marshall for 50 years. And we're kind of, we're at risk of, disassembling that intellectual architecture, which was one of our strategic comparative advantages in winning the Cold War.
Right. And just one last thing on this. Andy, by the way, in that office 25 years ago, literally 25 years ago, was talking about the Chinese as the next big challenge.
Yeah.
And we're thinking very hard, how did the Chinese think about strategic issues? Where are their investments taking them? All that. And they're sponsoring an enormous amount of work on that, which, then kind of got out through other channels into general discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is the team that says they're worried about China.
Yeah. So work on the, revolutions in military affairs, work on, the anti-access area denial, A2AD. People see that all over the place. None of that would have occurred to anybody had it not been for the pioneering work that Andy Marshall funded. Precision strike complexes. I mean, all of this stuff owes it to the work of the Office of Net Assessment, and a huge self-inflicted wound. I mean, I don't know any other way to describe it. Well, let's move on to other self-inflicted wounds, which was, they followed up destroying the Office of Net Assessment on the weekend by shutting down, the Voice of America and all the other radios, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Asia, and I guess Radio Marti. So I guess Marco Rubio doesn't really care about, freedom and democracy in Cuba.
Yeah, and this is, and by the way, done in exactly the same way. Overnight, you just lock everybody out. There's no communication with any of the principals. I mean, as I think I mentioned in the previous one, when I was dean, I had to, obviously infinitely smaller scale, we had to do a reduction in force. We had to get rid of a quarter of our staff, a half of our adjunct faculty. If you have to do something like that, you do it very carefully. You figure out where you can cut, where you shouldn't cut. And you do it compassionately, and you do what you can to acknowledge what people have done. These people aren't like that. They enjoy terrorizing people. It's such despicable. The VOA thing, though, I mean, this is if you talk to East Europeans, including Ukrainians, Poles, this is part of why we won the Cold War. Lech Walesa, was asked what kept him going when he was in prison or house arrest first. He said he listened all day to VOA. And, this is why, I've always kind of rejected the conspiracy theory that these guys really are Russian agents. But there's only one country that this really benefits, although it benefits the Chinese too. I suppose I should give them the benefit of the doubt and say they just don't understand the importance of, they don't care about ideas, they don't care about ideals, and so on. But it's honestly, if you really wanted to damage the United States, they've really gotten off to a great start.
Yeah, look, this is, we talk constantly about the need for, using all the instruments of national power. It's what the Chinese call comprehensive national power. And the Chinese have been envious in the past of our, comprehensive national power as they measure it. And part of that is, what Joe Nye called soft power, the ability to not just intimidate people with your military or coerce them with the power of your economy, but to attract them by the power of your ideas and your culture. And we have, been very adept at that as a nation. We haven't always harnessed it, as well as we could or should. But now the few instruments that we have, they're completely destroying.
So do you put this down to ignorance or malice?
Do I have to make a choice? I think it's both, honestly.
Sort of malicious ignorance. I think, look, one thing that I think is happening, certainly with defense, but with most of the government, you really have very few people confirmed in their positions. I think they finally confirmed the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So
Right.
you have, like in the case of defense, you have Hegseth, and then basically a bunch of people, usually quite marginal people who you can get in as political appointees without having to have them confirmed by Congress. And they're running amok, and they've always wanted to somehow. A lot of this is like Trumpian politics in general, grievance driven. They have a deep amorphous sense of grievance against the Pentagon, against people like you and me, against the way things have been. And the result is, I think you get a lot of very irresponsible younger people who are going around lighting matches in a room filled with cans of kerosene. And I have yet to see a positive vision of what they would like. Other than a military that can do lots of push-ups. And what I fear is you're going to end up with just this sort of rebel field, and absolutely nothing that takes its place.
Well, right, because I think one of the things both you and I are sensitive to is, it's very, very easy to kind of destroy capabilities like this, to put USAID in the wood chipper, to come up with some cockamamie complaint about the Voice of America lease on a building for 20 years, whatever Carrie Lake was babbling about. Trying to recreate those capabilities built up over a long period of years, very, 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 very difficult.
It'd be difficult even if you knew what you were doing.
Right. So, this is something you and I talked about in previous podcasts. We're watching generational damage go on here, and it's going to take, I'm afraid, at least a generation to recover if we ever do.
Yeah, alas, I agree with that. By the way, I will slip this in here in the middle of the podcast so it doesn't stand out too much. I think I have to admit that one piece that I wrote that you really didn't like, where I said it might conceivably not be quite as bad as we anticipate. Shame on me. It's worse. I promise I'll never do that again, Eric. I promise.
I have tried very hard not to ever on the show tell you that I told you so.
No, yeah, except you just did. But okay, no, but you're entitled once.
Well, let's move on to the important struggle that the administration is waging against our most intimate enemy, Canada.
So I had fun. Originally the idea when I began running for the Atlantic was like every other week, but the problem is these guys give me such grist for the mill that I keep on going. So the piece that just dropped is called "Invading Canada is Inadvisable," and it's I suppose you could call it a work of applied history. Because I did write a book called Conquered into Liberty, 2 centuries of battles along the Great Warpath that made the American way of war, which is actually a piece of serious military history from the end of the 17th century through the middle of the 19th, which makes a serious argument that the conflict between the colonies first and then the United States and Canada actually shaped a lot of how the United States approaches war. And in between, there's some rattling good stories of Benedict Arnold, the Battle of Valcour Island, and the Battle on Snowshoes and stuff like that. So the piece I said, look, this is the idea of the 51st state. It's really not such a good idea. If we do it the easy way, then it's a state that's bigger than the rest of the United States, 23 times the size of California, 40 million liberals. Like who wants that? Or if you take them in as states, then, it's a whole bunch more senators who are just going to vote for conviction when Trump gets impeached the third time. And in any case, it turns out like 85, 90% of the Canadians want to be Canadian. So what about invading? And so I just go through what's happened all the previous times that we've invaded Canada, which is actually quite a bit. Now, to be fair, they've also invaded us a number of times too. So I had a lot of fun with it. The part that I am happiest with is that I at one point I think I say that Hegseth has probably never heard of the Battle of Chateauguay because the last 3 letters are gay, and that's probably been wiped out of the DoD's websites. But he really should read about it because it shows you what happens when you invade Canada, which is you get whooped. So look, at one level, it's written with a bit of humor and a bit of nitric acid. The serious points of it first, that you even have to write a piece like that tells you something. And actually, one of the things that really struck me is the reaction of a lot of Canadians. I've got a lot of email from Canada, some people I knew, a lot of people I didn't. Some just said, "This isn't funny."
Oh, this from Canadians?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I'm sure that was their reaction.
And look, there's always been a certain amount of Canadian paranoia. That Fort Drum in upstate New York is as I'd like to say, a dagger pointed at the heart of Brockville, but which is the town across the river. But in a more serious vein, the thoughtful people that wrote to me, including some very close friends, they said, this is unifying Canada in a way that I never would have thought possible. And it's heartbreaking to us personally that it's against the United States, but it is happening. And the people don't think of the United States as an ally. It's freaking Canada, for God's sakes. I actually just today, I don't know if you've heard this, one of my colleagues was saying that the Canadians were thinking about buying F-35s.
Right. I was going to mention that.
And and honestly, if I were them, I'd either get a Swedish Gripen, which is good for flying off of roads in the middle of the winter, or a Rafale or something like that. It's terrible because I think I've actually come to the conclusion that Trump means it when he talks about these territorial acquisitions. I think the more serious thing is I think it is not at all inconceivable that he orders the seizure of the Panama Canal.
So it's interesting. I was talking with a journalist who was asking me about the kind of origins of America first, and what I make of sort of the ideological origins of Trump's foreign policy. And she concluded by asking me, is it conceivable that he would really, launch military action against Canada? And my response was, I don't think so. But the fact that you have to ask the question and that I have to hesitate before I answer already tells you kind of that we're in completely terra incognita here. And that the Canadians now, I think, are quite seriously thinking about joining the EU.
I would.
And that the transatlantic relationship is going to evolve to, a relationship between the Europeans and the Canadians. The Europeans, I think, are still kind of, I guess, so stupefied by this that they can't quite bring themselves to believe that it's really happening.
Yeah, I think, that's a really interesting point. I think it's true of some of them, not others. So last week I had 2 interactions with quite senior Europeans, both from I won't say which countries, but very serious countries with serious militaries. And the individuals concerned were very thoughtful. One group wanted to say, well, we've met with some reasonable people on the NSC staff, and maybe it's not as bad as all that. And I just said, this is wishful thinking. I mean, you do not. These people aren't the few reasonable people there are not calling the shots.
MAGA with a human face.
Yeah, but the other, quite senior, said, and it was a tough character. Said, I watched the ambush in the Oval, and I began crying. And that was not a softie talking. And it's, I think what's happening is that in some quarters in Europe, and I think this will spread, it's dawning on them that they really cannot trust us. And they cannot. I mean, I had another piece which I said, any European politician or other leader who puts his trust in the United States for at least the next 4 years is a fool. And I hate writing that, but I think it's the truth.
So Prime Minister Keir Starmer had a meeting in London over the weekend with, I think it was 26 chiefs of defense or their deputies who, they were meeting to talk about planning for this European reassurance force that will supposedly deploy to Ukraine as part of the ceasefire that Waltz and Rubio and Steve Witkoff, most importantly, appear to be negotiating with Putin. Trump and Putin are going to have a phone call tomorrow, the 18th. By the time our listeners and viewers see this podcast, it will have already happened. And all of this is on the assumption that there will be some kind of U.S. backstop, because there's no way that the Europeans can deploy this force without U.S. logistics support, without certain enabling capabilities, particularly intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, that the U.S. would provide, and potentially long-range fires. And yet they're busy planning this. And every time they ask the administration, they've been rebuffed. Hegseth told them in Brussels there won't be any American, commitment to this, and there won't. And they not only that, Hegseth told them he didn't want it to be a NATO operation, because they understand that a NATO operation, even if the U.S. isn't involved, in extremis, the U.S. could be called upon as the quick reaction force to pull anybody out who got into a dust-up or a fight with the Russians. You could just imagine that the Russians will be salivating at the opportunity to drive that kind of wedge between the U.S. and the European allies. and yet they're busy beavering away, planning all this, in my view, totally forlorn hope that this administration will ever agree to this.
Yeah, so I'm marginally less pessimistic than you are. It's a marginally less dark view, really only marginally. I think there are still Europeans, and I think the Brits are particularly prone to this, who think, I can't imagine the Americans won't be there for us. I mean, that has been the fundamental precept of British foreign policy, certainly since Suez, and even before. I think, on the other hand, there are a lot of Europeans, including the Nordics and the Baltics and the Poles, and probably some of the others, and elements in every other country, not necessarily the dominant ones, but there are elements who understand, no, things have really changed, and we may not be able to count on the Americans in the future. And I think there's evidence of willingness to spend the money that they need to spend on defense. And I think you really do see that, particularly in Germany. The problem, I think, is first, as you say, there are a number of areas where they just haven't invested at all, and so they're not really capable of doing things without our support. In principle, that could change, but they would have to invest aggressively and with really with a wartime sense of urgency, and that's what I think is lacking. I mean, they accept and we accept, just analytically, the idea that you cannot build expand a military quickly. I mean, that's just sort of a given now of how we understand modern militaries. That I forget, was it the Swedish military? Yeah, we're going to add 2 brigades over the next 10 years or something. I'm getting it wrong, but it's something along those lines. And we would be the same way, that it just takes forever to build military units. Historically, this has never been true. The technology exists so that it doesn't have to be true. Now, do you get the kinds of military units you want? No, you get things that are lower quality than the exquisite sort of professional militaries of today, but you can do it. You just have to be willing to do it. I think one of the sticking points is conscription. And there's a big distinction, I think, between those countries that have reintroduced conscription or introduced it for the first time, and those that have not. I mean, all countries struggle with recruitment. We have. But if you really think that you may have to go up against the Russians, you got to be willing to draft people. And then of course the curious thing is, like, if you take Norway, for example, they can't handle. They have a draft, and they cannot handle all the volunteers that they get, sort of the draft-induced volunteers.
I would suggest that that the seriousness of purpose is equal to the square root of your distance from the border with Russia.
Yeah. So you look at the Finns.
Yeah, I mean the Finns, the Norwegians,
Poles. The
Swedes don't share a border with Russia, but they might as well, given the Baltic and given the narrow kind of strip up at the north end of this of the peninsula that they're on, Scandinavia. The Poles, the other Central Europeans, Turks, although the Turks have a very complex kind of frenemy relationship going between Erdogan and Putin. And I think the French take this seriously. Well, at least the French government does. I'm not sure about the public.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the French military takes it seriously. I mean, the French military has always been a more serious military than... I'm not quite sure why this is, but American popular culture doesn't take the French military seriously, which is wrong. I mean, even in World War II, revisionist historiography, which I think is basically correct, says the French army at the end of 1939 was actually not all that bad. It deteriorates over the winter. But then, if you look at the war itself, the French you end up with a substantial French army that's part of the liberation of France and eventually of Germany. And it's actually quite a proficient military. And they were, you and I both saw them in the field alongside us in Afghanistan. And, they were, by all accounts, formidable.
They were very serious.
Yeah, very serious.
As were the Canadians, by the way.
Yeah, that's one of the points I make in the article. I mean, the article that I wrote is somewhat ironic in tone, but then I say, we really should note that 158 Canadians died fighting side by side with us in Afghanistan. And then I mentioned a whole string of battles from World War I and World War II that I'm sure Pete Hegseth has never heard of, from Vimy Ridge to the crossing of the Sangro.
Yep.
Juno Beach. I mean, it's, they really do have a long and distinguished military record. In fact, one of the points actually I make at the very end is proportionate to populations. They took more casualties than we did during World War II, and their forces during World War II were almost entirely volunteer. They only introduced the draft at the end of World War II because the problem was that the population of Quebec did not want to be drafted. It's actually, Canadian history is a little bit more interesting than people think. The Quebecois didn't really view France as a homeland. France was the homeland that had abandoned them. And there was actually a lot of pro-Vichy sentiment in Quebec. And the premier, until about, I think, 1939, was a man named Duplessis, who was really a Vichyite before avant la lettre, as the French would say. So in any case, they eventually were able to get a draft, but only for home service. Although I should also stipulate, there were a lot of French Canadians who fought very bravely during the war. And one of the famous Canadian regiments is the 22nd Regiment, the Vandus, which has quite a distinguished record as well. So,
you've convinced me we should not invade Canada.
Yeah. Well, besides, look, one of the things these guys all have their woodland retreats. So, they're going to go back into the woods, they'll retrain, and they'll all come back as snipers.
So let's switch gears for a second. Another thing that happened over the weekend was the announcement, or maybe at the end of last week, the announcement by Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu that he is going to fire Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, the internal security service in Israel, and which would leave him the last man standing from the cabinet before October 7th, ironically. Barr has been an advocate of the institution of a commission of inquiry into the whole October 7th, lack of preparedness, and said he takes responsibility and, but wants it to be done in a professional way, as did, those who were previously fired, Minister of Defense Gallant and the Chad, Halevi. And what struck me as interesting about the story was that Bibi apparently felt emboldened to do this by Trump's denouncing the deep state in the United States and putting essentially, political hacks in charge of the intelligence services here in the United States. And I wonder if we're seeing a kind of creeping international influence of Trumpism.
No, I think you are. I mean, that said, Bibi didn't need a model to behave this way. I mean, he's did it that way himself. But it's I think it's a sign. I mean, the psychological profiles are somewhat similar. I mean, they're both pathological liars. They both feel victimized and persecuted. I mean, it's really so striking that they're quite old. I mean, Trump is 78, 79. Bibi is in his early to mid 70s. Who've been successful by any measure. So you would think that they could rest on their laurels, but no. But in part because they know that they may be legally exposed if they don't have the protection of high office, feeling that they're being done in by a deep state somehow, and by a disregard of democratic norms. And it's, some of this I'm sure is imitation. I mean, the thing that would be worrying would be if we thought that this is an indication of a decline or decay of democratic institutions. I don't know if that's part of how you read it. I hate to say it is part of how I read it. That, I mean, for me, going back to the American context, the fact that Congress is just abrogating all of its responsibilities, that's a sign of political decay. At a certain level, I don't blame Trump for being Trump. That is what he is. I blame the people around him. I blame the people who know better. I blame, in our context, I blame Joni Ernst and Tom Tillis and all the rest. And, when they kind of quietly say, they never say it openly, of course, but when they quietly say to people who are willing to listen to them, well, my family and I are getting death threats, my response to that is, okay, either you take measures to protect yourself, an alarm system or concealed carry, or whatever it is that you need to protect yourself, or you say, I simply cannot do this job anymore, and you resign. But you don't,
Right.
You don't say, well, because I'm afraid, I will not do my constitutional duties. But you can tell me I'm being too judgmental.
No, not at all. I mean, it's really striking, how much Trump has, completely domesticated the Republican Party and how little it took, really.
Yeah. Which means that there was some pre-existing. There's a great line in Montesquieu, I think, who says, when a country falls in a single battle, something more is at work than the battle.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I think he has a preternatural sense, like all talented demagogues, for his adversaries' weaknesses and weak points, and how to bend people to his will. I mean, he's in some sense a completely Nietzschean character. I mean, it's just, as is Bibi. I mean, it's sort of just motivated by will to power.
Yeah.
What's troubling is just how many people have accommodated themselves and how, cheaply they've sold themselves out to this.
So let me ask you a different question. I mean, it's, as you and I sit here talking about these things, it's just one outrage after another. I mean, you and I this is just, the grist for our conversational mill here is just the last few days. Do you expect this pace to be sustained? For how long? And if it's going to slow at some point, why? And if it doesn't slow, what are the consequences?
I don't know the answer to that. I think they're going to sustain this pace because that is part of their strategy. It is to overwhelm people, to overwhelm the courts, which they know are slow and that they know can be slow rolled because they don't have any prospect of any other institutional opposition before 2027. right? I mean, the earliest institutional opposition they could face would be, I mean, my expectation is that Abigail Spanberger will be elected governor of Virginia in the fall, and I believe by a pretty easy margin. Um, um, I don't know who's going to be the Democratic nominee in New Jersey, but I suspect they will win handily as well. But those governors will not, be able to provide much institutional resistance to what's going on here. Um, so it won't be until the midterms before it's even possible that the Democrats take back, one of the houses, and it's probably going to be the House, not the Senate. Senate map is not particularly good one for Democrats, although I wouldn't rule out that the Republicans lose some seats they don't anticipate, because I think the consequences of what they're doing are beginning to percolate down, and people are beginning to understand. Americans hate taxes and they hate government, until it actually touches them personally. And, there's plenty of polling that shows how much Americans don't understand what the government does for them. I mean, you ask people, do you get anything from the government? And they'll say no. And they go, oh, well, do you get a Social Security check? And they'll say yes, because it's just sort of part of the wallpaper. So as this all starts to filter down, I think there's going to be consequences, but I think it's going to take much less time than, people, or much more time than people might hope before it manifests itself. And what my fear is that, I think there are two clocks going. One is the clock of resistance, both popular and then ultimately institutional, if there is an institutional break. Courts. Problem with the courts is they've got to be willing to abide by court rulings. In at least two cases over the weekend, they did not.
Right. Those airplanes that were headed to Salvador.
And the doctor who was deported to, Lebanon, from Brown, the transplant doctor. So there's that, clock, the institutional clock, and then there's the clock of the damage that's being done. And my fear is that, we get to the end of this and our democracy is unrecognizable because of all the damage that's been done.
You would really go that far?
By the end of the 4 years. I mean, at this pace, if this keeps up, I mean, the institutions of government will just be broken. I mean, in like all their dimensions. I mean, if you're talking about, well, just take one example. I mean, this is something that I pay particular attention to, as you know. We're undergoing a late but thoroughgoing modernization of all our nuclear forces, and we're behind because our adversaries have. And China has been in the midst of the largest nuclear buildup in recent history, if any history, and the Russians are now at the end of the modernization of their nuclear forces. It's been going on for 15 years. We've barely begun ours. The National Nuclear Security Administration and Department of Energy has for years been underfunded, and is now was in the process of being recapitalized in order to make good on, our own modernization efforts. And they're busy cutting people out of NNSA. And I don't know how.
I guess, I think, again, I'm going to be slightly more optimistic in that I think the damage will be enormous. And the damage to our position in the world and what the world will look like, and a lot of other people will suffer for it. I guess I do tend to think that at the end of 4 years, there'll be considerable revulsion against this and against the Republican Party. I mean, I think, now the Republican Party looks very, it seems dominant in some ways, and the demographics in some ways seem tilted their way. But I can also easily imagine a situation where it basically explodes, and they've done so much damage that you've got to create something else. But I mean, I think we'll have a Congress, we'll have a president, we'll have courts. What I think it'll be, though, is it's won't quite be Germany in 1945, Stunde Null, where you start all over again. But there'll be an element of that, and there'll be a profound need for a rebuilding, which is done thoughtfully. And I think people will want that. I mean, I don't think we're going to become a permanent dictatorship, because I don't think the American people want that ultimately in the long run.
Yeah, I hope that's right. And I certainly understand your point about public revulsion against what's going on. I mean, the ugliness and mean-spiritedness of this, as you mentioned, is I find repulsive, and I'm sure a lot of other people find it repulsive too. I mean, people want, a small but effective government, but they don't
Right.
want to see people treated, come to the office, you have 15 minutes to clean out your desk. Nobody wants to be treated that way.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that the revulsion, is there, and that it builds quickly enough to act as some kind of constraint. I guess the political problem I have is there's an old saw in politics: you can't beat something with nothing.
Right.
And right now, if you look at the Gallup poll ratings for the Democratic Party, they're at rock bottom.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they recover in a lot of rural areas, a lot of rural states.
I agree. I guess I tend to think that we've entered an era of politics where people come hurtling in out of nowhere. Think Obama, think Clinton before him, think Trump. And there's going to be somebody who's probably going to come hurtling in from nowhere. And you can build your own presidential campaign. It's not easy, but you can. It is in effect what people do. And you kind of, to the extent you need a party mechanism, you hijack it. So that's not the part that disturbs me. I mean, I guess part of the sort of deeper problem that you have now is that the party system is very, very weak.
Yeah.
Okay, you got to. We're just about at the end. You got to give us some hope for the end, Eric.
No, I don't. I'm under no obligation to give you a reason for hope.
Well, I'll look forward to next time.